2020 Active Aging Week. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce to you your Ohio State cheerleader team captains and Brutus Buckeye. And now, please welcome the remainder of the OSU cheerleading squad.
We are your hosts for the week for Active Aging Week. Before we get started, I have a few announcements. First of all, I want to make sure that you tune in to channel 51.1, the kiosks, the grapevine for up-to-date information. So we have about an 80% chance of rain today, so we want to make sure that you know what we're doing. Secondly, you should have all received a punch card or a stamp card. So for each activity that you participate in, you will get a stamp. Our team will have stamps also. Michelle and Jean at the front desk will have a stamp. We are recording, besides recording live this morning, we are also recording to put up on our FED YouTube channel. So if for whatever reason you didn't get an opportunity to see it this morning, you will be able to see it on our FED YouTube channel. We will let you know when that's uploaded and ready to go. Lastly, but more importantly, is please this week wear your masks. Make sure you wear phone. So let's take this opportunity to go through our slides again in terms of what we're doing each day. So today at 8:30 a.m. you should have gotten your coffee and donuts. So I hope you enjoyed those. Right now we're doing our kickoff. At 12 o'clock, Culinary will be delivering a tailgate lunch. That's just part of the culinary lunch. It's not a special lunch. It's what they're serving. And we will have some OSU highlights playing at that time. At 1 o'clock, Dan Sullivan, who's the executive director of the Memorial Tournament, will be out here. We're planning to have him in the main entrance, but if something happens that is pouring down rain, we will be doing recording him for YouTube. And at 3 o'clock, we're hoping to host the Columbus Zoo and some of their favorite friends. And at 7 o'clock tonight, we will have the FBD Picnic in the Pops in your room. So we will be delivering some wine for you to enjoy while you're listening. On Tuesday, September 29th, we will be in Cleveland at 9 o'clock. Andy Hallam will be doing his Botanical Garden walking tour. He will be meeting everyone at the main entrance. So the gardens are looking very beautiful, so enjoy those for the last time before the weather starts turning. At 10 o'clock, we'll have our Rock and Roll Hall of Fame karaoke with a special guest out in the main entrance. At 1 o'clock, Ann Vega is having open art studio for a Cleveland Museum of Art project. If you're interested in that, please go down. At 3:30 and 4:30, we have two different times. We're doing a Great Lakes Brewery beer tasting with Tim Plunk in the Legacy Dining Room, or Legacy Patio, sorry. So make sure there's a sign-up sheet in the book, program book. So there's two different times, 3:30 and 4:30. And at 7 o'clock, we'll be showing a film on the Cleveland Clinic. On Wednesday, September 30th, we will be in Cincinnati. At 10 o'clock, we'll be going to the Great American Ballpark out in the main entrance and have a wiffle ball game between the Cleveland Indians and the Cincinnati Reds. So even if you're not participating, come out and cheer your team on. For lunch, we'll be serving Cincinnati chili, again delivered to your home through Culinary. At 2 o'clock and 3:15, we'll be boarding the Cincinnati Riverboat and do some gambling. So again, those are sign-ups as well. There's 2 o'clock and then there's 3:15. During that time, we'll be serving Grader's ice cream. And at 7 o'clock, we'll have a documentary on the Underground Railroad. And on Thursday, we will be visiting the islands of Lake Erie. So from 11 o'clock to 2 p.m., our parking lot will be filled with 30 antique cars sponsored by the Arthritis Foundation. So that's going to be a lot of fun to see all those old cars in the lot. At 2 o'clock, our own George Barlow will be doing a presentation on 51.1 Ice Age Legacies in Ohio. And at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, Tim Plunk will be doing Ohio wine tasting, again out on the Legacy patio. Again, that's another sign-up, so please sign up in the book. And at 5 o'clock, we're going to have our Lake Erie fish fry. Again, that's out in the main entrance. And our last day, Friday, October 2nd, we're celebrating Amish country. So from 9:30 to 12:30, you'll have an opportunity to ride in an Amish buggy, horse-driven buggy by Mel. And we'll also be having a craft and food fair outside the main entrance. At 1 o'clock, Rosemary Anderson of the Plain City Historical Society will be doing a presentation on the Amish in Plain City. And we will end our day at 2:30 with our annual talent show, and that will be live streamed on channel 51.1. So we're excited for the week. We hope to see many of you out. We're hoping the weather holds out so we can all be together outside. And now it is my pleasure to bring to you a special guest, Jack Park. Maybe many of you have heard of Jack. He is an OSU historian, and we are so pleased to have him here talking with you for the next 30 minutes about OSU. So just hold on tight and we'll have him right here. Bear with us just a couple of minutes. I told Jack to be in the Zoom room at 10:15 and it's 10:13. So give us just a couple of minutes. What can I do? I could do a little song and dance. Yes, I do want to say a special thank you to our cheerleaders today. In fact, let's put on some fight music while we're waiting on Jack. Feel free to sing or dance in your room, do a pom-pom routine. Got a little hang on. All right. Come on, Jill, get up here with your pom-poms.
Hello, Jack, are you hearing me? Jack, are you hearing me? Try to speak to the microphone, Scott. All right, Jack, are you hearing me?
Yeah, I sure can. Can you hear me?
All right. I think we're getting there now.
Okay.
Welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Happy to be here and kind of nice to do a Zoom today on a Monday morning. Big weekend of football and Ohio State will be playing in 26 days. So at least we're going to play football. That's a good sign.
26 days. You're not counting down, are you?
Yeah,
We-
open up on the 24th.
I know you know this. You're joining us for our Active Aging Week 2020.
Yep.
Active Aging Week 2020, sort of our high holiday here at Friendship Village, and we are excited to have you be a part of it. We are usually watching Ohio State football at this time of year. Things have us waiting, like you said, a couple more weeks. So we're going to have you fill in our desire to see Ohio State football, but we're going to be learning about Ohio State football. For those of you who don't know Jack, he is an Ohio State football historian. He could probably tell you about any game, any player, any coach. He might be able to tell you what seat you sat in at Ohio Stadium when you were a student. He knows that much about the history of Ohio State football. So again, happy to have you. I'm going to put you on full screen and let you take it away, Jack. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, my pleasure to be with you here on this Monday morning. This is the 28th of September. It was the 28th of September that the Super Sophomores of 1968 played their very first game. It was against Southern Methodist at Ohio Stadium, and of course they went on for an undefeated national title that year. And that year began on the 28th of September. This has been quite a year. Obviously, things important, much more important in our lives than football that are going on now with the pandemic and the tremendous civil unrest we're having in our country and everything. This has not, however, been the only football season that was disrupted by a health condition. If we go back 102 years to 1918, that's the year of the Spanish flu. And there was college football played that year, but it was very sporadic. Games were pretty much either decided to be played or not decided to be played, sometimes 2 or 3 days before the game. For instance, Notre Dame in 1918 had a brand new coach, and not too many people would have recognized the name at that time. His name was Newt Rockne. And Rockne brought his Notre Dame team to Cleveland for the very first game in his career. That was on the 28th of September. Same day as today, of course, there, 102 years ago today, Rockne's first game at Notre Dame. And they beat Case at that time. Now, 1918 is before Case and Western Reserve merged to form Case Western Reserve. That didn't happen until 1967. So in the earlier years before that, Case and Western Reserve, those two universities very, very close to each other, they were over on the east side of Cleveland, they were big rivals in themselves. But Rockne's team beat Case 26-6 on the 28th of September of 1918, and Rockne's Notre Dame team would not play another game that fall until November. In fact, it was November 2nd that they played their next game. So if you can imagine a major college football team going the entire month of October without any football, that's what happened basically. Ohio State played 6 games that year. They were supposed to play 7. A couple of them got canceled and only one was made up. They actually didn't play their first game that year, which of course was the year of the Spanish flu, which said there 1918. I want to make sure I got the date right here. The first game was played on the 5th of October. And it was a victory over Ohio Wesleyan, 41-0. The Michigan game that year was to have been played on October 24th. Now, in those days, you played Michigan anytime during the season. In fact, it wasn't until 1935 that the Ohio State-Michigan game for both schools was moved to the last game of the regular season. So Ohio State was to play Michigan on the 24th of October. They actually rescheduled that for the 30th of November. And Michigan won the game 14-0 back in 1918. The Buckeyes finished with a 3-3 record. And games were just kind of, scheduled 3 or 4 days in advance. The flu was so bad in 1918, the Ohio State University actually shut down for about 3 weeks in October. And then resumed play. Conditions were such in most cities, such as Columbus, of course, that there could be no gathering of people greater than 10 at one time. I'm not sure how the classes were taught. I would have thought they had a lot more classes, or classes with a lot more than 10 students in them, but I don't know. But anyway, 1918, the year of the Spanish flu, is somewhat, of course, similar to what we're doing here in 1918. When we look at basically the early years, Ohio State was not the real power the way they are today. In fact, the real powers at the very beginning of football were 3 teams to the east. That would be Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. And then the football spread to the west, and we were called the West at that time, even though we're kind of in the Midwest, or the eastern part of the Midwest today. But as football spread, what our area, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, became kind of known as the West. And the real power in this part of the country at that time was Michigan, University of Michigan. The University of Michigan went 4 years without losing a game. And that was 1901, 2, 3, and 4 under a man by the name of Fielding Yost. And he's the guy that put Michigan football on the map. He probably had more to do with developing the Big Ten than any other coach. And it was just before that 7 universities decided to form a conference. And the leader of that group was Professor James Smart, who was president of Purdue University. And he called 7 schools together at the Palmer House for a meeting, the Palmer House there in Chicago. And they met in 1895. In those 7 schools were Michigan, Purdue, Illinois, Northwestern, Chicago, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Those 7 schools, and they decided they would form a conference, and they started playing football as a 17 conference in 1896. 2 more schools joined in 1902. That would be Indiana and Iowa. And Ohio State did not join the conference until 1913. Up until that time, the Buckeyes really were not considered a big enough, a strong enough football program to join this conference. So basically, the Big Ten had been playing 17 years before Ohio State joined in 1913. And before joining, we were playing mostly Ohio schools, schools like Marietta, Muskegon College, Ohio Northern, a lot of games with Western Reserve and Case Institute Technology, some games with Kent State a little bit at that time. Bowling Green came in a little bit later there, University of Toledo. A lot of games with Otterbein. It's interesting, I think Ohio State opened up with Otterbein something like 14 years in a row until joining the Big Ten, and yet Ohio State has never played Capital University. And of course, those 2 schools are very, very prominent Division III schools right here in Franklin County now, Otterbein and Capital. And a lot of games with Otterbein. In fact, let me look up the record for Otterbein. I think it's something like, I think we played them 20 times and we won all but 2 of the games. Yet we never played Capital. Just never played Capital here. So, some very humorous things back in those early years of Ohio State football. 1898, which would have been the Buckeyes' 9th year of football. Marietta is playing in Columbus, and as was typical at that time, they traveled by horse and buggy, as best we can figure out at this time. And they came to Columbus with 12 players. 12 players, 11 starters, of course, and 1 substitute. The Marietta coach was a man by the name of C.W. Showalter. The Ohio State coach was Jack Ryder. Well, there was no scoring in the first half. So as we get into the second half, and there are no quarters at that time, up until the early years, football was strictly 2 halves, much like women's basketball is today. Men's basketball is 4 quarters, and women's basketball is 2 halves. I don't know why. I don't know why it is then, but in the early years, college football was simply 2 halves. So as Ohio State and Marietta go into their second half of their game in 1898, 2 of Marietta players become injured and can't continue. They're not life-threatening injuries or anything like that, but they are serious enough that they cannot continue to play. So Marietta does not want to forfeit the game because they can't field 11 able-bodied players. So in a very, very unusual move, Coach Showalter of Marietta walked across the field and asked Coach Ryder of Ohio State if he could borrow one of Ohio State's substitute players to line up with Marietta so that Marietta could field a team of 11 players. I guess Ryder probably somewhat reluctantly agreed. He did agree to it. The player that is assumed to be the one, as best we can figure out, is a halfback by the name of Bob Hager. Well, interestingly, playing for Marietta, on one of Hager's very first carries for Marietta, he went 67 yards around Ohio State's right end for Marietta the touchdown. And Marietta won the game 10-0. So I imagine that Coach Ryder for Ohio State was quite stunned. He probably wished he had not done that. And I would doubt if Coach Ryder ever again loaned a player to a visiting team as he had done in 1898 against Marietta. In those days, too, when we mentioned that the games were played in halves, and the half could be no longer than 35 minutes, and it's my understanding it could be no shorter than 25 minutes. but you could have a 25-minute half, a 30-minute half, a 35-minute half. The teams simply had to agree upon the lengths of the halves. Now, if they couldn't agree, then whoever won the toss would determine the lengths of the halves. Now, in 1905, October 14th of 1905 for that matter, Denison University comes down from Granville to play Ohio State here in Columbus. At that time, Ohio State would be playing their games at what is known as Old Ohio Field. Old Ohio Field ran north and south at the corner of High Street and Woodard. And the university school's there now. In fact, there's a big McDonald's right across the street from where that original place was. And the games were played there through 1921. And then Ohio State moved into Ohio Stadium in 1922. And of course, we'll soon be coming up on the 100th anniversary of Ohio Stadium. But let's go back to this Denison game of 1905. Ohio State wins the toss. They can't decide upon a half. Ohio State wants 35-minute half. Denison wants 25-minute half. Since they can't agree, the officials say, well, since you can't agree, Ohio State, you won the toss. You determine the length of the halves. And Ohio State said, yeah, we want 35-minute halves. Well, the Denison players said, well, if we're going to play 35-minute halves, we're not going to play. We're not going to play 35-minute halves. And with that, the entire Denison team walked off the field and headed back to Granville. They never played the game. Now, it goes into the record books as a forfeit, a 2-0 forfeit. And while Ohio State may have won the games, they lost a little bit in their treasury. As it was at that time, with the game being canceled, then the home team had to refund the money to all the people who had paid to get into the game. Well, as it turned out that day, some youngsters had sneaked into Old Ohio Field without paying, and then when it was announced that the game was forfeited, they actually stood in line and got what would be called a refund, although they never paid to get in. And the number of figures are kind of interesting here. Ohio State that day collected $1,078 at the gate, but then refunded $1,206, which means they refunded $128 more than they took in, simply because a lot of children had sneaked into the stadium and then stood in line to get their refund. I don't know how much it would be to get to go into a game at that time. I'm going to guess 25 cents, maybe 50 cents, something in that nature there, which of course was a lot of money back in, with that year being 1905. The last game, or I should say the last season of Old Ohio Field was 1921, as we mentioned, and Oberlin played here at Columbus in 1908. 1921, I'm sure, 1921. And it's the last time Ohio State has ever lost to a school from within the state of Ohio. Now, this was a major upset. The Oberlin won the game 7-6. And it was a huge win. It was just really a huge win. The team probably was way overconfident. The Ohio State team was way overconfident. And basically, just was beaten by a team that probably should not have beaten at all. The coach of Ohio State at that time was Dr. Jack Wills, John W. Wills. And Coach Wills was so upset with his Ohio State team. Now again, they played at Old Ohio Field along High Street, and they dressed at the what was known as the Armory. Some of you are probably been around a while. You may remember the Armory. It stood kind of on the east end of the oval and a little bit on the northeast end there. And it was actually, it looked like a castle. And it had a gymnasium inside of it. That's where the Ohio State basketball team played their games for many years up until probably into the 40s. And then they started playing basketball at the Coliseum out at the fairgrounds and eventually in St. John Arena in 1956. So, this is where the team dressed. Wills brought the team back into the dressing room after losing to Oberlin 7-6. And he was just so upset with them. He says, fellas, do not take off your uniforms. We're going back out and practice. And so he held scrimmages the rest of the afternoon, clear up into the evening. And they were long and they were hard. He was that upset with his team for losing to Oberlin 7-6. And it must have worked because Ohio State won their next 4 games by shutouts, by combined scores of 76-0. But that's the story of the last team to defeat Ohio State from within the state of Ohio, that being Oberlin College, 7-6 in 1921. Paul Brown came here in 1941. He had quite a career up at the, of course, at Massillon High School, and he lost only 1 game his first year, 1941. He led Ohio State to its first national championship in 1942. But in 1941, the year he was announced as a coach, and he actually replaced Francis Schmidt, whose last year was 1940. And this is long before the days of television and so forth. And so, you know, it's announced that you have a new coach. The announcement is mostly made over the radio, probably, and through the newspapers. That's basically the communication mechanisms at that time. And very few people probably knew what Brown looked like. Maybe they had seen a picture of him in the paper, maybe. But they, you know, a lot of people didn't know what he looked like. So his first game is against Missouri at Ohio Stadium in September of 1941. The team was about 35 players. They all come into the stadium in one bus, and they enter at the south end, and they open up the gates there at the south end to let the bus pull in, and all the players and coaches get off and go into the dressing room, of course, to get ready for the game. Well, after Paul had gotten off the bus, he heard some friends yell at him. And some of his close friends had come down from Massillon to honor him and see his first game as head coach at Ohio State. So he walked outside the stadium, outside the gates, and shook hands and had a few friendly words, I'm sure, and received best wishes from all these Massillon friends. While he was doing that, the bus pulled out of the stadium and the gates were shut behind Paul Brown. So as Brown turns around to go into the stadium, now the gates are locked, they're shut. So he just goes through where the ticket taker is, basically the porthole man that's taking tickets, and he starts to go through that gate. And the porthole man stops him and says, "Hey, I need to see your ticket for the game." And Paul Brown said, "Well, I'm the new head coach. I'm Paul Brown, and I really don't have a ticket for the game. I'm the new coach, and I got to get upstairs there in the dressing room to be at my team." Well, the porthole did not believe him. Didn't know what he looked like, and he is supposed to have said something to him like, "Oh, you're Paul Brown, are you? Well, if you're Paul Brown, I'm President Roosevelt." And with that, he said, "Hey, you have to have a ticket just like anybody else, and don't try to talk your way through here by pretending you're somebody you're not." And Brown could not convince him he was really the new head coach. So what Paul did, a lot of you are familiar with the stadium, he walked around to the southeast corner, and if you know, there are big towers on each of the ends of the stadium. And some of those towers at that time were the dressing rooms. So Paul picked up some rocks and began throwing rocks up against the window in that tower, making a noise until somebody finally came out and looked down to see what was going on. And pretty soon the manager came down and looked down, and he raised up the window and he yelled down to Paul Brown, "Hey, what's going on?" Brown explained to him that he'd been locked out of the stadium and that the portholeman couldn't be convinced that he was the new coach, and would somebody come down and please verify that I am the new coach at Ohio State. And so they did that, and Brown finally got in, and that's the way Paul Brown entered Ohio State to coach his first game at Ohio State. It was a 12-7 win over Missouri, who was coached by Don Thoreau, very, very prominent coach at that time. And of course, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Brown's team went on. They only lost one game in 1941. That was the Northwestern, 14-7, and then they went on to win the national championship the next year, which was, of course, a very, very big year for Ohio State since it was first ever national championship. The Buckeyes were known as the graveyard of coaches from 1940 through 1950, 51, if you will. During that period of time, 12 years, Ohio State had 6 different head coaches. Head coach in 1940 was Francis Schmidt, and he had some good teams, but he was Francis was very lacking in administrative skills, and the team kind of got away from him. He was really good at drawing up plays, but his practices were very disorganized, and a lot of the assistant coaches were just sitting around basically watching, and so there was a lot of confusion in the football team this last year, and he finally was asked to resign. And he was replaced by Paul Brown in 1941. Now, Brown was so young that after the 1943 season, he entered the Navy and actually became head coach of the Great Lakes Naval Training Base Station up in the Great Lakes, Illinois there, kind of halfway between Chicago and the Illinois-Wisconsin line. To replace him, athletic director L.W. St. John named Carol Widows as the acting head coach. Now, Widows was one of Brown's assistants. He was probably definitely his #1 assistant. He had come to Ohio State from Massillon with Brown, and so he was given the title acting head coach. And lo and behold, in his first year as the acting head coach, his team went undefeated. They had a 9-0 record. Les Auerbach, the quarterback of that team, became Ohio State's very first Heisman Trophy winner, and Willows was actually named College Football Coach of the Year. He was the first Ohio State coach ever to be named College Football Coach of the Year, and he did that in a season when basically he wasn't really officially the head coach, he was the acting head coach. Well, the next winter, Paul Brown was approached by a man out of Cleveland, the name of Mickey McGuire. I want to say McGuire. I should have that name down. Mickey McBride. It was Mickey McBride. And McBride was a self-made guy with about a 6th grade education who'd become a multi-millionaire in Cleveland. He ran taxi cab fleets. He owned a newspaper. And he fell in love with football, even though he'd never seen a football game until he went to Notre Dame on a parents' weekend, because he and his wife had a son that was a student at Notre Dame. And they went to Notre Dame for this parents' weekend, and part of that Notre Dame weekend was seeing a Notre Dame football game, and McBride just fell in love with football. So he went back, and he talked to the sports editor of his newspaper, basically, this would have been in 1945. And he said, no, I'm sorry, yes, it was 1945. He said, how do I get involved in football? And he was told that the sports editor, a very prominent, powerful man, sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, a man named Arch Ward, was wanting to form a new professional football league that would rival the National Football League. Now, the National Football League began in 1920, and of course, this year of 2020, the National Football League is celebrating its 100th anniversary. And so by 1944, the National Football League had been in business, 1943, 1944, been in business about 24 years. And Ward wanted to set up an 18 league to rival this National Football League. And so one of the franchises that he selected was Cleveland. McBride was able to convince Ward that he had the financial means to put a team into Cleveland. And once that was all settled, McBride now, who knew nothing about football, but was a pretty smart man evidently, because he went to McBride, he went to Arch Ward, the sports editor of the Tribune, Chicago Tribune, and he said, okay, now, I don't know anything about football, but I want to hire the best coach in the National Football League, and I'd like to hire that coach away from the National Football League to run my new franchise in Cleveland. And Ward said, you could do that. But he says, let me give you a suggestion. There's a young man up here at Great Lakes who I watched very closely in his 3 years at Ohio State. He's now up at Great Lakes because he is so young that he's needed to serve his country. But when the war is over, World War II is over, he will most likely go back to Ohio State as the Ohio State head coach. If you want to hire the best coach in the country, I would recommend that you talk to him. And McBride said, well, yeah, I don't know anything about him, and his name's Paul Brown, it doesn't mean anything to me. Could you get the two of us together? And so Arch Ward arranged a meeting in the office of the Chicago Tribune between Paul Brown and Mickey McBride, the new owner of the Cleveland team. And after a couple meetings and maybe a little bit more time, Brown made the decision to not return to Ohio State, but instead become the founding coach of the Cleveland franchise, which would then be named the Browns. And of course, they played their first season in 1946. Well, this irritated a lot of Ohio State people. It irritated them very much. And so, basically, what St. John did then, St. John was really upset. I mean, he was really upset with Paul Brown. And he made Widows now the permanent head coach in 1945. In other words, he took the name acting off the head coach title. Well, Widows had an undefeated season, 9-0 in 44, and in 45, he had a 7-2 record. So basically, he had a 16-2 record over 2 years. Not bad. And after that 45 season was over, he went in to see St. John, and he said, I'd like to have my old job back as an assistant coach. He said, why do you want that? He says, I never wanted to be the head coach at Ohio State. I never wanted that job. I don't like the job. I don't like all the pressure with it. I don't like all the speaking engagements that goes with it, and all the alumni meetings I have to go to. I always wanted to be an assistant coach. And when you asked me to take over for Paul, it was supposed to be a temporary thing. In other words, I was going to hold down the fort, so to speak, until Paul came back. Well, Paul's not coming back, and I don't want this job permanently. Could I please have my old position back as an assistant coach? Now, can you imagine that today, or at any time for that matter? And so, one of the most unusual coaching moves ever made in college football, Mr. St. John had Paul Bixler, another assistant, and Carol Widows switch jobs. In other words, Bixler went from becoming an assistant coach to becoming the head coach. And Widows went from the head coaching position back in his old job as an assistant. In other words, they just switched positions. Well, the pressure of that job was obviously much greater than Bixler thought it would be, and he only stayed 1 year. He had a 4.32 record. It was not a very good season at all in 1945. And when that season was over, he resigned to become the head coach at Colgate. A lot of the people that wrote about this, a lot of the sportscasters wrote it as going from the big time to the little time. At that time, Colgate had a wooden bleacher stadium that seated about 10,000 people. And of course, Ohio Stadium in the 40s seated about 75,000 people at that time. And so what Ohio State then did, they brought back one of their own, Wes Fessler, who had been a 3-time All-American with Ohio State in 1928, 29, and 30, and was now head coach at the University of Pittsburgh. And they brought Fessler back to take over as head coach of his alma mater, where he had been a 3-time All-American, and where he also won 12 varsity letters in 4 different sports: football, baseball, basketball, and track. Well, he took over as head coach in 47 and did pretty well. Basically, he had about a 61% winning percentage for 4 years. But as the time went along, he really realized he did not like the pressure of being the Ohio State head coach. Now, in 1949, he led his team to a share of the Big Ten title with Michigan, and then Ohio State's first ever Rose Bowl victory, which was over California at the end of the 1949 season, 17-14 over Cal. And there's a lot of talk that he was going to resign that year, and the athletic department, Mr. St. John in particular, convinced him to stay on. Well, after the 1950 year, he resigned. And in fact, his last game at Ohio State was the famous Snow Bowl game, or infamous Snow Bowl, whichever you wanted. That was one of the most unusual football games ever played. Michigan defeated Ohio State 9-3 without registering a single first down. And it cost Ohio State the Big Ten title. Now, Vic Janowicz would win the Heisman Trophy that year, and yet his coach, Vic's coach, Wes Fessler, would resign. So whoever's going to take over for Fessler would be the 12th head coach within a period of, the 6th head coach within a period of 12 years. And that happened to be Woody Hayes, who was actually the selection committee's second choice. Their first choice was Don Perot, that famous coach at the University of Missouri, who accepted the job and 3 days later changed his mind and called Vic Larkins, the director of athletics at that time, and said, "Mr. Larkins, I've changed my mind. I'm going to stay here in Missouri after all." It was always told that basically Perot didn't give any real specific reason for changing his mind, but most people thought was once he had the job and he got to thinking about it and knew he was going to be the 6th different head coach in a period of 12 years, maybe he thought he had it pretty good there at the University of Missouri, and why get into something like this at Ohio State when the coaches only stay a year or two and then they quit. So the selection committee then made Woody Hayes their second choice, and as you all know, that put an end to the stigma of Ohio State being the graveyard of coaches. Woody would stay for 28 years. He'd have 13 Big Ten titles. He'd have a Heisman Trophy winner in Hopalong Cassidy, a two-time Heisman Trophy winner, the only one ever, in Archie Griffin. Cassidy, of course, in 55, Archie in 74 and 75. And as we said, 52 years ago today, the super sophomores of 68 played their first game, and those guys, at that time you could only play 3 years of varsity competition, and those guys played their 3 years of 68, 69, and 70, and they lost only 2 games in those 3 years. They went with a record of 27 wins and 2 losses, and that's the highest winning rate for any 3 consecutive years in Ohio State football history. It's not only one percent winning rate, that's the highest ever. Well, hey, it's great to talk with you here about Ohio State football. I'm looking at my clock here. I see my time is just about up. I'd be happy to take a couple questions for you here as we get ready for what will be, of course, the 2020 football season at Ohio State.
Hi, Jack, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just 1 second here. Okay, now I'm back with you and back with everybody. Well, Jack, we want to thank you so much again for being with us. Get us in the spirit of what normally goes on in the fall is Ohio State football, largely important to a lot of us here. So this was just great to get us in that spirit, and also you kicked us off. There's another football term for you. You kicked off Active Aging Week, and we're looking forward to the rest of Active Aging Week.
I'm sorry I could not have been with you in person, but this is the next best thing, and I've been using this Zoom a lot. Actually, I have not given a speech in person now since since the 9th of March. I had another one for the 12th, and that one was canceled. Usually this time of year, I'm speaking out once or twice a week, sometimes even 3 times a week when we get into October, and I fly around the country a lot. I have not been in an airplane since returning from Sacramento, California for a speech out there. I returned on March 2nd. In fact, I have not been out of Upper Arlington more than a couple times in the last 7 months, and that was basically to go up to visit my daughter up in Dublin, Ohio. So it's a different world right now, and thank goodness that we do have things like Zoom that we can stay in communication with each other.
Yeah, this has been great. Put us on your list. We want to be on your list when you do start leaving Arlington. Come on up to Dublin and give us a visit.
I will do that, absolutely. And thanks very much to Gene and everybody. And it's been my real pleasure to be with you. Go Bucks.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all. Yes, thank you, Jack Park. What a wonderful talk. Thank you all for joining us for our kickoff this morning. And stay tuned for 1 o'clock, where we will have Dan Sullivan, Executive Director for the Memorial Tournament.